Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Women at Bain and our global alumni community, welcome to this episode of Bain's Alumni Spotlight Series. We're thrilled to have you here today for this event, which is part of a broader alumni speaker series highlighting the incredible achievements of Bain alumni from across the world. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Jen Andrasco, EVP and Global Head of Alumni here at Bain & Company. And today I'm joined by fellow Bainey, Kimberly Rayner-Smith, who is also a teammate of mine in the Washington, D.C. office, and Kimberly will be moderating our event today. Kimberly is a director with our BEST team, which, if you're not familiar, is Bain's global integrated approach to well-being. The BEST team aspires to foster a best-in-class well-being-centric culture that enhances Bainey's impacts on clients, teams, and communities. Kimberly is an executive coach focused on leading our coaching program here in the Americas. She's also an active member of Women at Bain and a close personal friend of today's guest, Bain alumna, Jenna Fisher. Kimberly, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. And it's so fun for me to be here today with all of you, and more importantly, with Jenna. Jen and I have been friends for a while, so it's wonderful to have this discussion and with all the other alumni and Bainies that are joining us today. So welcome. I am thrilled to announce Bain alumna Jenna Fisher, a leadership expert, managing director at Russell Reynolds Associates, one of the top recruiting firms globally. Jenna has been helping women navigate the upper echelons of American business for more than 20 years. Her book, To the Top, I felt like I needed a great background for you, hun, for this, which hit bookstores in March and recently made Wall Street Journal's bestseller list, challenges companies to close a gender gap in their executive and board ranks. With compelling case studies of women who succeeded in the C-suite, social science evidence, and her own experience garnered from climbing the corporate ranks, To the Top provides both the inspiration and a playbook for how we can all create meaningful change in our world. I do recommend it. Jenna received her MBA at the Wharton School of Business and attended Duke University Law School and Rice University. She grew up in the suburbs of Boston, is married, has a 16-year-old son, can't believe he's 16, and a 13-year-old daughter, and two very high-energy poodles. She spent 2 years in our San Francisco office and was an active member of WAB. Jenna, we're so glad to see you today.
Oh, it's such a thrill to be here with all the Bainies. Thank you so much for having me, Kimberly and Jen and everyone. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So as we both mentioned and Jen said in our intro, we've got people joining from all of our offices and our alumni. Excited to hear more about your experiences, of course, and this book. So we're going to talk a little bit about your Bain experience, your time at Russell Reynolds, and of course, your personal journey climbing to the top, before we open it up for the broader group of questions toward the end. So first question. We've given the official intro, but in your own words, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What don't we know?
Oh my gosh, what don't you know? Well, you might know everything, really. Let's see. Well, I think that I am no different from a lot of people in that I did not wake up when I was, 18 or 20 years old with the epiphany of, oh, I want to be an executive search consultant. When I grew up, I don't think I even knew what that was, or if I had any inkling, I probably had, if anything, a sort of more of a disparaging view of it than a positive one, because I wasn't getting calls from the likes of the Russell Reynolds of the world. But it took sort of a non-linear path for me to land where I am today. But I'm so grateful that I stumbled into the work that I do because I love it so much. And I really do credit a lot of that to Bain, quite honestly, because I remember very clearly. So when I was an undergrad, I thought I was going to be an academic, but then I realized you have to be willing to live anywhere if you're a professor to get tenure. And I was like, oh, I don't really want to live anywhere. I really want to be in the Bay Area. And so then I went to law school and did the whole, law school summer intern thing. And after law school was recruited to Bain. And it was there that I think beforehand, I had never really seen or known the value of an MBA. I had a very monolithic view of what an MBA was in terms of, oh, that's for, people who want to go to New York and work on Wall Street and be an investment banker. And that never really resonated with me. And I remember at Bain, I and mind you, I was a sociology major who went to law school. So Excel was not my love language, like I wasn't sending pivot tables in the middle of the night to people. I remember having a conversation with one of our partners who was writing one of my letters of recommendation for business school. And I decided to apply. And he said, okay, what's your pitch? What's your stick? What are we going to say about you? How are you going to differentiate yourself? And I was like, well, I don't know, maybe I just want to come back to Bain and be a partner here. And he kind of looked at me quizzically, and I never will forget this moment. And he said, yeah, I don't know if I see that happening. And I was sort of like, what are you trying to say, And he said, look, you're doing fine here, but we're judged on three things. It's always three things, right? It's like, there's the team piece, there's the client piece, and then there's the value add. And he's like, you're amazing with the team. Everybody loves working with you. You're incredible with clients. Like, you're better than most of our partners. But, the value add, the quant piece is really the most important. And you're just average at that. And at first in the moment, I was like, oh my God, nobody's told me I'm average since 7th grade softball. And I was like, don't cry. But I got through it. And upon reflection, I realized it was not wrong. And, thank God Bain has a culture of such direct feedback to give me that, because it really was liberating. Because I think up until that moment, I'd lived so much of my life doing what I thought was sort of the safe bet, what looked good on paper. It wasn't that I didn't like the things I did. I did, but none of them really played to my best attributes that really differentiated me. And he said, if you could find something that you're already naturally top decile at and work really hard, you could be the best in the world at it. And I was like, well, great. That's great advice. But what is that? And it took me probably a year of talking to people. I must have had 100 conversations with a variety of folks. I didn't know if, do I become an entrepreneur? Do I go into marketing or brand? I had no idea. But when I stumbled into the world of executive search, it was actually a very senior partner, Vince Tubkin, for those of you who remember him, who was the one who suggested it to me. And I was like, what's that? He connected me with people at all the top firms, and I just fell in love. And so here I am more than 20 years later. And I really do. I mean, not a day probably goes by where I don't have some sort of connection to somebody I used to work with at Bain. In fact, my kids, who, as you mentioned, are now 16 and 13, they're like, did everybody work at Bain? Because everybody used to work at Bain. So
kind of
back.
That's such a great story. I don't know if I've heard that one before. What drew you to Bain originally? Because you're right, because we thought about law school, you figured out that the law wasn't it. What do you think originally drew you to come to Bain?
Well, it was funny because when I was in law school, the business school at Duke is right next to the law school. And so I had a lot of business school friends, and there were a lot of classes that we would take together. And a few of my friends there were going to Bain and McKinsey. And remember, this was 99. So Bain and McKinsey were really struggling to fight, with the pets.coms of the world for talent. And so they were starting to think for the first time about non-traditional hires. And so they didn't interview at my law school, but they were starting to approach people with, other forms of advanced degrees and PhDs. And so there were a couple of folks that I knew from school who were going there, and they said, hey, I think you'd really like this because it's client service, but I had found law, although, I love the people I worked with, I had found it to be, for me, I was doing corporate law, and it was a bit lacking in creativity, shall we say? And I'm sure had I stayed long enough, that would have happened. But, as a young associate, the work is not particularly, at least for me, it wasn't super engaging. And so they were sort of like, hey, the work at Bain is going to be so much more interesting and heterogeneous. Why don't you try it? And so I still remember my first interview with Neil Cherry, who's still there. And, asking me how many dimes it would take to stack up to be the height of the Empire State Building. And
I remember that, yes.
And the rest is history.
Oh, that's wonderful. So when we think about Russell Reynolds, and you've done some extraordinary work there, can you tell us more about your current role and what gets you most excited to come to work every day?
Yeah, well, I feel like I have such a privileged role. And again, a lot of people don't really think about executive search until perhaps you need an executive search consultant in your life. But, it's really no different from any other professional services like law or management consulting or accounting or investment banking, in that we are hired by companies who are our clients. we're paid on retainer to, in this case, find extraordinary talent for them and match up the best people in the world and to go out and compellingly and clearly advocate on behalf of the company to land those individuals for them. And while the companies are our clients and we're, fiercely advocating for them, we also develop very trusted and deep relationships with the candidates who could become clients, certainly. And so I think one of the things I love about what I do is that we're sort of like the proverbial priest or rabbi to the career world, because I mean, let's face it, most people get to a point in their career, if they're, sort of high ranking enough, where their spouse may not be able to give them great advice as much as they would want to. They might feel uncomfortable talking to their friends or colleagues about compensation or their career path or journey. And so we really have this very, kind of sacred spot in the professional ecosystem where somebody could be, on the one hand, a client. At the same time, they could be a candidate, they could be just a trusted member of our community. And I've loved building those really trusted, deep personal relationships with people over the past 2 decades. And, fortunately, it's a business that rewards tenure. And the longer you do it, I think the more valuable you are to your clients. And really, it was my role as an executive search consultant that got me thinking about writing this book, because I've had the privilege of interviewing so many thousands of incredible people over the course of 2 decades. And I very often will get connected to women in particular who the fact pattern goes something like, they have extraordinary academic pedigree and credentials, they've worked at the top companies in the world, and then perhaps, they had their second or third child and they opted out of the workforce for what they thought was going to be a short period of time, but all of a sudden it's been a decade and they want to get back in.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do that in a financially meaningful way. And so often I would hear from women, I'm the only one. I thought, well, you're not the only one. So I started convening groups of women. And I had this idea of like, how can companies really keep more women on a sustained path to success? And that was really the genesis of this book, which has been met with so much, so many open arms around the globe, which has been really gratifying.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's funny, I just hit that section in the book not too long ago, talking about women as they were coming back into the workforce. And it very much resonated with me. I mean, do you remember, like, I worked part-time for a bit and thinking about going back, and it was daunting and hard and really like, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? So I appreciate that part. So you were saying you had and talked about the inspiration for the book.
Yeah.
What was surprising that you learned in this journey with the book?
Oh my goodness. Well, so many surprising things. I mean, this is not surprising, but I mean, I interviewed over 50 women who are just amazing around the globe, a very intentionally heterogeneous group. Women are so impressive. We constitute over 71% of valedictorians, over half of undergraduate graduates, over half of graduate school graduates, and yet, we're only 9% of CEOs in this country, which I think is really shameful. And I think the reason is that we're not more than that, but we will be. It's not because we're not leaning in enough. We're like leaning in so much, we're tipping over. Yeah. But what I realized throughout the journey that I went on last year in researching and writing this book is that the systems and institutions and structures within our organizations need to change. And what I mean specifically by that is, I think what we've all historically thought of, and I would be guilty of this as well as a recruiter, what we've all heretofore thought of as sort of the successful career arc of, you learn in your 20s, start to earn in your 30s, yep. You really ramp up in your 30s and hopefully reach some sort of career nirvana by the time you're 45. If you're not in the C-suite by 50, forget about it. It's not going to happen. I mean, we're all living longer, hopefully. I think that what we've all sort of been fed to believe is this successful career arc was really promulgated and predicated on what worked for men. And it's not that men were trying to harm women, far from it, but this system was set in place over 100 years ago at the advent of the industrial era, when women were not, by and large, participating in the world of work outside of the home. And so we really need to think about this. If we don't want to lose over 50% of the talent that exists in our world, which I don't think we do. And I, by the way, I believe that all of the things I espouse in my book will come to pass, not because of some philanthropic notion or some do-gooder notion, but really because of cold-blooded carnivorous capitalism, because we don't want to lose this talent. And so I think companies need to think more expansively about creating, and I talk about this in the book, webs, not ladders. How can we think, and I think you're a great example of this, Kimberly, of how you've kind of reshaped and transitioned your career over the course of time. And I give Bain a lot of credit too in being creative. And I think the best organizations like Bain will be really smart to capture and retain talent, because it's one thing to recruit a woman, but to retain her throughout the entirety of her journey, through her 30s, when she might be trying to, get pregnant, stay pregnant, give birth, breastfeed, all these, physical, challenges that as of now still fall on women, and beyond, to see her through. I think that's really the test, and smart companies will get religion around this.
No, that's so true. How is the journey for you with writing a book? I was going to ask you about that earlier, but I just can't even imagine figuring out how to put this together and thinking about some of the stories you heard, et cetera. So what was that journey like?
Yeah, well, I initially had the idea for the book probably 8 or 9 years ago. And my initial idea had been writing a guidebook for young women, because again, I get to meet so many incredible men and women. And I thought, not that I have it all perfectly solved, but I feel like I've learned a lot from people I've met in my career professionally. And then as I got busy with my life, I, had to sort of shelve the book. But then when COVID hit, a couple of things occurred to me. First of all, I no longer was commuting. So I had an extra 2+ hours in my day every day, which was huge. Secondarily, I think we saw a real sea change in what our companies are looking for in their leaders in terms of leadership attributes. And that, I think, has been a very good thing for women. And we could talk more about that. Thirdly, we already had all the means of communicating and collaborating electronically and remotely that we have, but we never were forced to use them in the same way. And of course, COVID really forced a new normal. And although the pandemic, I think, was particularly onerous on women at the beginning with children homeschooling and all that sort of thing, I think over the course of time, I came to see the optionality that hybrid work can provide as a real benefit for women. And there have been a lot of studies, and you and I talked about this the other day, where we're seeing that exact pattern in the data. And so I sort of decided to dust off my 40-page dossier that I'd written several years ago. And I said, maybe now's the time to really delve into this. And that was the moment as I made my list of the 50 or so women I wanted to interview. And I'm a very planful person. Some might call it OCD. I like to call it being organized. I went through very methodically and, just interviewed several women a week. And that was really when my target audience shifted a bit, because I realized that women are awesome and we already have everything it takes to be successful. We just need our institutions to catch up with our brilliance. And so I decided to write it more geared toward leaders and people running companies. Now, I did at the end as sort of a nod to younger women coming up through. I have a gray box at the end of every chapter, which is sort of a checklist. If you're a young person or just in a hurry and don't have time to read both, you can go through and think about some of the things that I enumerate. But that was really the process. So I started it in earnest. I had kind of an outline going into the new year. I started writing and interviewing in February, and then I finished the first draft of the manuscript at the end of October. So it was pretty fast and furious. It was, getting up at 5 a.m. every day and working every weekend and every night. But I got it done. And then I was iterating and editing. We went through 15 edits of the book between the end of October and my birthday in January, when I sent it off to the publisher. I said, that's it. I don't want to know if there's a comma splice anywhere else. And then it came out in March. So it was really actually pretty quick.
That is pretty quick. I want to come back to that comment you made about why you think now is the time. Can you elaborate more about why you feel now is the time to really be looking at gender parity and how we have a real opportunity here with some of the things that have happened with COVID and remote work, hybrid, and how that's impacting things?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it used to be thought that the more traditionally male, and I'm putting that in air quotes, but the male forms of leadership, like being disruptive, being risk-taking, being heroic, being galvanizing, all of these more loud, extroverted traits, those were the hallmarks of a great leader, almost like a militaristic kind of leader. That and, probably being 6 feet 3 inches tall. But what we've come at Russell Reynolds to learn through our exclusive partnership with Hogan, which for those of you who are familiar or not, Hogan is generally considered to be sort of the preeminent executive assessment tool. So we have tens of thousands of data points of C-suite leaders who have gone through Hogan testing. And so we can look at where they score, not just sort of in a vacuum, but rather, at how they stack up to either their industry leaders or functional specialists that sort of look like them. So we can contextualize it a bit. And what we've learned is actually most dispositive and predictive of leadership success is actually the ability to, yes, at times have some of those louder, more extroverted qualities. But what's most salient is how can you flex and be seemingly at times the opposite of those things. So it's the ability to be at sometimes loud and forceful and risk-taking, but at other times being the sort of oppositional elements of those. So being the quieter, more connected, empathic, kind, more leading from the center as opposed to the front kinds of leaders. And that's where I think we saw women really shine as leaders during COVID. Of course, men can embody these qualities just as much. And in fact, one of the things I did as part of my research was I asked a chief data scientist at Hogan, I said, can you please look into they have millions of data points. Can you please look into your data sets and tell me all of the ways in which men and women are statistically different in terms of how we show up? And every month we'd have an update call. And, bottom line though, there were no statistically significant differences, none between men and women. There was one that was almost statistically significant, but it was not, which was something called commercial, which is how likely are you to choose a career based on the remuneration you'll receive. Men are slightly higher in that, but it's not statistically significant. It's about a fourth of the height differential between men and women, for example, which is statistically significant. So I thought, okay, so women have everything it takes to be successful. So that was one. And then I think the other element secondarily, as I alluded to, was really this shift in how we leverage technology. And I think COVID, again, gave us the tools and forced us, frankly, whether people liked it or not, to measure the outputs and not the inputs. I mean, I think we all can relate to those people we've worked with in the past who we see them coming in at 6 in.the.morning and leaving at midnight. We're like, wow, that Bob, he's killing it. He's crushing it. But actually, who knows what Bob was doing all day long in his office, maybe he was crushing it, but maybe not. And I think COVID has really done away with FaceTime. I mean, not to say, of course, there are lots of important reasons why we want to come together and look in the whites of each other's eyes and sort of work shoulder to shoulder with each other, but it's probably not quite as frequent as what it used to be. Again, I look at how we got to where we are today. How do we all end up commuting an hour each way into offices? Well, back at the onset of the industrial era, people were working in factories and they had to physically come to assemble widgets on a line, and managers had to watch them to make sure they were doing their work because they couldn't trust them. That is not really the model of our knowledge workers of today, right? We can look at somebody's technological footprint online to see what they're contributing or not. And so I think, if we can have the boldness to continue to really look at the outputs and not the inputs, we can be much more thoughtful. I think there's a little bit of a tendency for all people probably to idealize what has happened in the past. Say, oh, the past was better than no, as my in-laws like to tell me, who are in their late 80s, the past was not always better. And by the way, when I was growing up, you couldn't go to Costco and spend $12 on a delicious apple pie. You'd have to spend all day making it. And I think the same is true. Sometimes when I hear leaders saying, oh, you're going to get your butts back in the office 5 days a week, that's the only way to be successful. I think, well, that's one way to be successful, perhaps. But it's confirmation bias if you think that's the only way to be successful. And so I think we need to really talk to our teams and people we're leading to see what they need from us so we can all be successful collectively.
Such a great point. I mean, so much has changed since you and I entered the workforce. And I think we're just seeing such interesting evolution across so many different areas. And I do think hybrid work has opened up space for a lot of different things. My husband and I were talking about how at his company, people with disabilities and having the ability, and it's easier to work at home for this one particular person he knew. And it's just made it that much easier and more accessible. And it's like, why wouldn't we do that and have that? And I think it's just so neat to see how different companies are making those changes.
I think Zoom, absolutely. I totally agree, Kimberly. And I think Zuma has been a great equalizer in that regard, not just for women, but, whether it's people of color, people who are differently abled, people who, may have other impairments or issues, everyone's box is the same size. I recruited a woman twice actually during COVID to 2 different boards. And I never met her in person because we weren't doing that. And she came to one of my book events actually back in March. And we were both laughing because she's 4'11". And she said, "Don't I seem so tall on Zoom?" And I said, "You really do. I thought you were a giant." And, it used to be that whoever was the tallest or the loudest or sitting in the front of the room, those were the people who got the attention, right? I remember when I started at Russell Reynolds, we write these candidate specifications for our clients in advance of them meeting our candidates. And it's sort of a letter that talks about their background and their fit or not against the position description. Okay. And so when I was learning how to write them, when I was an associate, there was a partner who said, "Oh, go into our system and pull up all of the candidate letters by this particular partner who's long since retired, but he writes the best ones." So I very dutifully went and printed them all out because that's what we did back then. We killed lots of trees and printed things out. And literally the first one I read started like this. "He walks in from central casting, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a thick head of sandy blonde hair. John and his wife, Martha, have been happily married for 35 years with their 3 boys, blah, blah, blah." And I thought, even back then, how is this relevant to his performance in his job? I'm all for getting to know somebody, and thankfully we do not write candidate letters like that and have not for a very long time, to be clear. But this was, we all have unconscious biases of what we think a great leader looks like and how they show up. And I'll tell you, when I was in the throes of finalizing my manuscript in October, I was guilty of doing this myself. And I will never make the mistake again, but it was early morning. I was getting on a flight to LA and I walked onto the plane and I was greeted at the door by a woman who I thought was the flight attendant, said good morning, whatever, sat down, and then fast forward 20 minutes, I see her go into the cockpit and then she comes on and she announces herself and she's the pilot. And I thought, oh my God, I am writing a book on gender equality and I made the assumption that she was the flight attendant. Shame on me. Yeah. But if I'm doing that, and I'm not to say I'm perfect, but it's something near and dear to my heart. There are just lots of ways I think that shows up.
Yeah, for sure. Taking a bit of a slight turn for something a little bit different, but related. When we think about balancing, personal and professional commitments, especially in high pressure environments that you and I have both been in, how important is balance to you and how do you define that?
Yeah. So one of the things I know to be true is that society gives women a lot of messages about how we're supposed to look, how we're supposed to achieve, how we're supposed to be as mothers, as wives, as friends, as daughters, as community members, as workers. And it is an impossibility for us to meet all of the societal expectations that are placed upon us. And I have seen, unfortunately, far too many incredibly talented women who have kind of thrown up their hands and said, I can't be all things to all people. But I say having it all does not mean doing it all. And you have to figure out what is important to you. And so I have never sought to be, the person who does every single thing, because it would be, I wouldn't even sleep, it would be a physical impossibility. And so before I had children, I thought, okay, what's most important to me, or what do I think is going to be most important to me? And obviously the priorities shift as kids age and they need different things and you want different things. But, I never gave my kids baths, I mean, they got bathed, but not by me. Um, we never had family dinner together, which I'm not proud or happy about, but that was a reality of my job. Like my husband and I, we never really got home before 6:30, and the kids were hungry at 5 or 5:30. And it wasn't until COVID hit that we ever had our first family dinner together during the week. And I was okay with all of that because I thought, you know what, I'm doing the thing. Now, what was more important to me, I wanted to read to them every night. I wanted to sit and do imaginary play with them every night. And so I would structure whatever travel I had to do to minimize time away from them. I'd take a red eye after I put them to bed at night, and I'd race back home the next day, even if it meant, really not sleeping, because I wanted to be with them. But I think, if we feel like we're going to get somebody else's 10 out of 10 on every single element, we're fooling ourselves, and we're setting ourselves up to fail and not be able to achieve. So, a long time ago, actually at Wharton, I had the privilege and benefit of taking Stu Friedman's leadership class. And one of the things that he espouses in his research, and he's written many books about this, is this idea of like all these different spheres of your life. So whether it's your work sphere, your personal sphere, your health sphere, your community sphere, think about what's most important to you to achieve in each one of them. And maybe there are ways of overlapping them so you can get kind of a twofer or a threefer even. And so I've always tried to ascribe to those kinds of time saving and, kind of self-directed, what's meaningful to me. And I've never judged myself by what other people, because everybody has different priorities. Like some people might love going to the farmer's market and buying organic vegetables and making baby food. Like I can barely make iced tea. Let's be honest, that's not my sweet spot. I mean, it's just not what I love. And I'm not going to try to look good to somebody else to be Martha Stewart in that regard. So I think you have to really decide what's important to you, and then check in, like, how am I doing? How am I feeling? Did I feel like, were there parts of my sphere that didn't get the attention they needed today or this week? But don't feel like any one day you're going to achieve, balance. But I don't even aspire to that. I aspire to happiness.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. And I do think we start realizing what sort of gives that energy and what takes it away. I can't say that I figured it out right away, but you're totally right. Simple things like which, if your partner loves to cook, maybe they enjoy making dinner when you're like, oh, I could skip dinner, making dinner, right? And that's part of that journey I think we all see in figuring out what balance might mean to us. And as you said, how it changes over time as well.
And I also think that, some people feel, because of how they were raised or not raised, that they need to do or be certain things for their children. And I'm sure that's true in some regard.
Yep.
I really do think that if your children have a happy, fulfilled parent, of course you need to love them and spend time with them and all that. I think that is such a great role model. And I mean, I know personally, I would not have married the man that I did if his mother hadn't been a working woman, because she raised such an independent, self-sufficient person. He can do everything for himself. Like, I don't need to parent him. He doesn't get man colds and fall down, sick on the sofa. And I really give her a lot of credit for that. And I'm really grateful, because I think that if we have strong women role models, that will inure to the next generation in all kinds of beneficial ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get to the Q&A, just one last question. For the people that are on here today, where can they go to learn more about what you're up to and, of course, the book, and to see what's happening?
Thank you. So I am a pretty active poster on LinkedIn. Every Tuesday, I release a newsletter with some ruminations of things that I'm seeing or hearing. And so you can certainly subscribe to that. And for companies that are interested in having me come speak, I'm offering bulk book buys. I really want to get this message out. I really so in the core believe in it. And I think the more men and women who hear it, there's really nothing that controversial in any of it. I think it's really a mindset shift. There are things tangibly that companies can do to help inculcate more diversity at the top. But I think it's something all of us so desperately want. But we sometimes don't know. We sometimes think it has to be some big onerous thing, but as one of the women I interviewed in my book, Sarah Mensah, who works with another former Bain alum, John Donahoe at Nike. Sarah Mensah is the GM of the Nike brand. Actually, she just got promoted to this. She's now the GM of the Jordan brand. But when I interviewed her, she was the GM of the Nike brand, and she's just a rock star. And one of the things she shared with me is that whenever she does anything pertaining to her son, whether that's going to watch him play soccer or going to take him to the dentist or whatever, she does this thing she calls leaving loud. And she goes around and she, has her phone and she tells everybody on her team, hey, I'm going to be out of the office for the next couple of hours. I'm with my son, the dentist or whatever. Just call me, text me if you need me. And it seems like such a little minor, trivial thing. But I think there's so much power in that because, and this is something men and women obviously can do, especially leaders, to make it okay and psychologically safe to have a life outside of work, whether that's a child or a pet or a family member you're caring for, or just a hobby or something, a volunteer project, whatever it might be. I mean, we all have lives outside of work, hopefully. And so whenever I have somebody who apologizes to me because they got to do something with their kids outside of work, I'm like, don't apologize to me. And most of all, don't apologize to people who are more junior than you are in your teams, because you're setting an example. And so I think little tweaks like that make a big difference.
Absolutely. Ooh, so we're on to the rapid fire piece.
Oh, okay. Bring it on.
Yes, that it was coming, and the two of us were talking about this. So similar to what we've done in some of these other alumni series, we have, I think, what do we have? 4 questions, rapid fire for Jenna. Okay, favorite book?
Okay, I'm far too voracious of a reader to have one favorite book, but I do want to put a plug in for a new book that just came out by a Bain alumna, Melissa Edelman, who lives in DC, who just wrote a really fun book called What the Neighbors Saw. I just read it. It's a great kind of thriller, takes place in the suburbs of DC. And I always love to support other Bainies. And she's a rock star, works at the World Bank, and wrote this in her spare time. So her first book, fiction, which I find very exciting, but also very daunting to imagine writing that. So anyway, go buy it, read it.
Oh, good plug. Yeah, good plug. Love a good thriller. Okay, go-to podcast.
Oh, How I Built This.
Yeah,
love that one. Listen to every single episode. Guy Raz.
What are you most excited about this month?
This month. Okay, well, I've had a kind of a big month already. So I'm going to say something that already happened, which is it was my daughter's bat mitzvah, which was so special. And then on the heels of that weekend, which was amazing to see so many friends and family, I surprised her with a trip to Disneyland. Just the two of us went. And then we saw Taylor Swift in LA, who is amazing. I didn't even know if I would know the songs. It turns out I knew like all of them. And just a really great kind of girl power sort of moment. So it was pretty special.
She's killing it.
I know. I mean, I don't know that she knows that her 14th birthday may not be this exciting, but
I'm dying to know how she does it. I really do. I'm like, where are you getting this energy to keep this up? And then she's adding more tour dates.
She's brilliant. She's a genius.
And yes, with her songwriting and what she's put together for the tour, but we could digress on Taylor Swift. And lastly, what is the best advice that you've been given?
I think it goes back to what this partner at Bain shared with me. And I, when people ask me about giving advice to their children or young people coming up through, it was funny. I had a mom recently ask me, her daughter just started college, and this girl's very smart and really good at math. And she said, do you think she should go into banking or private equity? And I was like, well, what does she love? Like those are both great paths, but there are a whole lot of other things. And I think it just goes back to, you need to find your passion. And this is especially true for women because, I mean, let's face it, for those of us who want to have children, when you're trying to solve that simultaneous equation of work and family, there are going to be a lot of distractions thrown in your way. And if you don't love what you do, it could be easy to opt out or easy to not give it your all. And so, I mean, I think it's important for everyone to find what their passions and strengths are. And sometimes that word passion seems a bit too daunting, but what's the thing that you uniquely do better than anyone? And if you can really focus on that and get better, you really can be the best in the world at it. So I think it's really digging deep and not being constrained by what other people think. I remember when I had this epiphany about that I wanted to do search, and it was when I was in the throes of applying to business school. And I remember I went home for Thanksgiving, and I remember sitting around, we were at my aunt's house, and they were like, oh, what are you going to do after business school? And I was like, well, I think I'm going to go into search. And my aunt, who I call Aunt Ohio very lovingly, because like the pollsters don't need to spend millions of dollars. They could just go to her to find out who's going to win the presidential election. She looked at me, she's like, wait a minute, like your parents paid for all these fancy schools and you worked at all these, like Bain and all these places, and you want to be a headhunter? And I remember in that moment of clarity feeling like, well, we don't call it that anymore, but yeah, I do. And I'm really excited about it. And I think it's just having peace with what it is you want to do and not feeling like you need to make somebody else's top 10 list.
Yeah. To the top. Yeah. Just to show everyone the book again. Jenna, thank you so much for all of that. It's so wonderful to hear about the story and the journey and some of the things you've learned along the way. I feel like we could be talking for hours, but Jen, let me
Wow, what a conversation. First of all, the dynamic between the two of you. I'm so thrilled that we have friends who've known each other for so long. There's such depth and richness to the discussion. And Jenna, I love the comment about the leaving loudly. Actually, it is a practice that I try really hard to emulate also with my teams here at Bain & Company, about ensuring that they know when I'm with my family and the reasons why I'm out. And I think it's so important as leaders to model for our teams what it looks like to be a full person, right? And to bring your full self to our teams, because it, I think, first of all, creates such greater empathy and allows people to really be much more authentic in their day life. I feel like we could chat forever, but there are some really great questions in the Q&A. So I'd love actually to ask some questions, both Jenna to you and Kimberly also to you as we wrap up our time today. And the first one, Jenna, for you is, you touched on some internal introspection that it took to discover some of your differentiators that ultimately helped define your career path. And one of our audience members was wondering if you could do a little bit of a deep dive on that process that you went through, that introspection process.
Yeah, well, first of all, I did hire a coach, sort of a career coach, who walked me through a battery of different diagnostics and tests, and that was helpful just to sort of see some output from that. But I think my real the real benefit that I garnered during that year of talking to people was really in the conversations I had, and asking them, what did they love about what they did, what did they not love about it, what's the best part of their job, the worst part of their job. I also, one of the things I also think is really important, and I talk about this in one of the chapters in my book, is the importance of thinking through the financial impacts of what you want to do. I remember when I had been in high school, I had taken a battery of some tests about, what should you be when you grow up? And all of the tests came back saying I should be either a clergy leader, a social worker, or a teacher. And all of those are obviously laudable and so critical to our society and wonderful. And thank God people do those jobs. But I remember thinking, I always knew I wanted to live in the Bay Area. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be like living at the poverty line. Like if I want to do that, live it, if I want to have a family. And I was, really, I think I had the benefit of parents who really just pounded independence into my head from such an early age that I never wanted to rely on anybody else financially. And so I think that's an important element too. Like what can you do that can also be financially impactful? So I think having that pragmatism, but just talking to people, and people are so helpful and genuine. If you go to them and you say, I'm really interested in what you do, would you talk to me about it for half an hour? Most people will say yes. And so that was really instructive for me. And, as I already discussed, I took a couple of nonlinear turns and twists in my path too, that helped also personally instruct me. What did I love? What did I not love? I knew I loved professional services. I knew I loved working with really smart people. But ultimately, although I'd had both those things in law and Bain, what had been missing was a focus on human capital.
Well, along those lines, there's a question, what advice might you have for someone who's going through a difficult promotion process and unsure of whether they are in the right role? And Kimberly, actually, maybe I can ask you to answer that first, and then Jenna, we'll come over to you.
So they are thinking about the promotion, not sure they want the promotion, just to make sure I understand the question right.
Yeah, I think it's that they're going through that promotion process, right? That's naturally part of their perhaps professional development, and unsure of whether or not they're actually in the right role.
Yeah, it's hard. I probably would add on to what Jenna said. It takes a bit, and let me get back to this question. It takes a bit to figure out sort of what your thing might be. I always tell people that I always knew I wanted to help people, but I wasn't sure how that was going to go. I was like, maybe I'll be a therapist. I would have been a great pediatrician. It's been hilarious. But it took getting into my role at Bain with the Bain Career Advisory to realize that coaching was my sweet spot. But guys, like it took me a bit to get there and try a few things. And to Jenna's point, talking to people and understanding more about how I can bring what is a little bit of my superpower to help other people. You know, Jenna's superpower, connections up the wazoo. She's so good at it and remembers all those details. And it takes a bit to figure out and really be able to sit in it. You know, and it takes a little bit of courage to say, hey, this is something I really want to do more with. So to the person in the promotion window or thinking about it, it does create some uncertainty. I hear you. And it also maybe is a great opportunity to reflect and think about what are parts of the role that I really like? What am I looking forward to? What are areas where I still want to grow? These promotions are not going to kill you one way or the other, I promise. But it's starting to think about what your path is about. So it can be a good moment to just pull up a bit. Jenna, what would you add to that?
Well, I would say I'm going to take a little bit. I think everything you said is super valid and right. Just to take a different twist on it, perhaps. You know, I think sometimes people lack the sponsorship they need within organizations. And so when I advise people about what kinds of organizations they should want to be a part of, it can be really helpful to have people who you feel like kind of look like you, who have made it to the top. And it's not a mentor so much as a sponsor. And I want to delineate between the two for a moment. So I think women in particular, lots of us have great mentors. Those are people that we want to emulate, that we see ourselves as, that we admire. And that's wonderful and great to have that. But I think that for people to have really long-term careers within a company, you need to have the right sponsorship. And this is another place where I think companies can really be impactful in connecting high potential women in particular to people of influence, you know, men and women. And so this is a role where men have a huge job to do as allies to help promote women. And so I would say to somebody who's coming up through their career thinking about, you know, is this the place for me? I would say, do you have the right sponsorship? And sponsors are the people who are going to fight for you, who are going to give you opportunities, who are going to talk you up when you're not in the room. And I know I was really lucky early days in my career to have a sponsor here at Russell Reynolds. And it was not somebody who I was friends with. We did not have lunch together. We did not hang out together. We did not play golf together. We worked together and we worked really effectively together. I worked my butt off for him. I'm sure I made him a ton of money. But there was reciprocity in that. And he gave me opportunities that people who were 6 years my senior didn't have. Yep. And so I think you have to think about who are your sponsors. And if you feel like you're not getting the right opportunities, then that is incumbent upon you at the level and go to your sponsor or people in your organization to say, hey, you know, I was thinking about this. What do you think of me for this role? Is it something I should be considered for? And if you feel like you don't have the political capital to fight for it, your sponsor should. And if you don't have that, then either you need to change that about your situation, or perhaps you're not in the right organization.
Great point.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Jenna. And I think that identification of who are those sponsors and investing in those relationships and the engagement that you have, and there is a absolute level of proactivity that's required there as an individual to go out and build those sponsor relationships. It's been a huge part of my success of sort of building my own Bain career, if you will, and being able to design the career that I've wanted within this organization, and also how it made it so easy to leave Bain and then come back because I had very strong sponsors that were there supporting a return. So I think that's a really great advice.
I think one thing that Bain does very well, and I saw this even one of the women I interviewed for my book was Heidi Lock-Simon, who Kimberly and I worked with in San Francisco. And she was one of the progenitors of, I think, what's now known as Take Two at Bain, which was this idea that if for anybody, whatever your passion or need is outside, if you ever need 2 months to sort of take off, you could do that in the way that the case structure worked, sort of lent itself well to that. But I think Bain has also been just very progressive, and you need to make sure you have sponsors who are also flexing with the times. And I'll share just a very brief personal story, which was that early days when I was at Russell Reynolds, I had a very well-intentioned partner who I'm still dear friends with, who came to my office. I had just gotten promoted. I was the top performing associate at the firm that year. And he said, wow, you're doing such a great job, congratulations, but can I give you some feedback? I'm like, bring it on. Feedback's a gift. And I love the color pink. If you come into my office, this is my home office, but if you come into my office is all pink folders, pink pens, pink Post-it notes. I wear a lot of pink, love pink, makes me happy. He's like, you might want to tone down the pink a little bit. We're in professional services. You need to kind of be a bit of a chameleon. True to him, he grew up at Goldman. He was wearing a light blue Oxford button-down shirt and khaki trousers. That was his uniform. And I was like, okay, wear less pink. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. Because it brings me joy and I want to be who I'm going to be. And so then fast forward 6 years later, I had become a partner, and I was one of the top partners of the firm that year. And he came to my office and he said, congratulations. I think I owe you an apology. And I was like, what for? And he said, well, I think the pink thing seems to be working just fine for you. And I really give him a lot of credit that A, he even remembered that, and B, that he came back and said that, because to me, that was like growth mindset on his part. And I think it goes to the question you just posed a little bit, Jen, in that if you're in the right place, you can be who you are and be successful. If you're not in the right place, it's really hard to be who you are, probably. And so I think that's a very important foundational element as well.
I know we have a number of other questions here, but there was one follow-on that I think is worth spending just a minute or two on, which is if you are someone who is desiring a sponsor, but doesn't know how to really seek that person out or how to cultivate that relationship, if this is sort of new territory, any advice on how to start there, Jenna?
Yeah. And I think sometimes, okay, here's what not to do. Don't go up to somebody and say, will you be my sponsor? That's just awkward. But, for me, and the person who I now retrospectively give credit to as having been my sponsor, I never called him that. I don't think I even knew that word. It was never a discussion we had. Not to say you couldn't have that discussion, but it just wasn't something that, 18 years ago I talked to anybody about. But I think what's important is to look at who are the people, and this is going to sound a bit Machiavellian, it's not meant to, but like, who are the people of influence who matter in your organization, who you think you'd like to work with and learn from, and be prepared to work your butt off for them. But maybe and they don't have to be the CEO. They could be 5 years ahead of you on the experience curve. And if you don't know who those people are, ask, a trusted person in your organization. Sometimes HR has a good point of view on it. I'm sure people like Kimberly at Bain have a good point of view on it. But figure out who are those couple of people that it would be worth your investing your time in, and then see if there's an opportunity for you to work with them. Maybe there's a formal way to go about it. Some organizations do have sponsorship programs, but if not, then make those opportunities, find those opportunities, create those opportunities, be creative, be tenacious. Most people aren't going to turn down somebody working for them, if they're good. So it might take a little bit of research, but I think the best way is to figure out a way that you can contribute to make their life easier, that they're going to appreciate, and then laud you for publicly.
What a great response. I think we have time probably for 2 more questions. So changing tacks just a little bit. Question about kind of your venture to write a book. So as someone with a primary business and law background, how did it feel when you first realized that you wanted to write a book? And then what was the support system that you built to help get you through it? And the question was, did you have someone similar to your career coach to sort of help guide you along that journey?
Yeah, one of the best pieces of advice I got actually from a former Bainey Meredith Brenholdt, for those of you who know her, because she's written 2 books now, was create a followership on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is such a wonderful and supportive community for professionals. I'm not on any other social media. I think I have a Facebook account, but I never go on it. But I'm on LinkedIn every day. And I do find that people on LinkedIn are super supportive of one another. And so even before I started writing my book in earnest, I started posting once or twice a week something meaningful to create a followership. And so by the time my book was launched, I had over 10,000 subscribers. And so that really buoyed my efforts. Of course, marketing here at Russell Reynolds helped. But I would say for me, it was all about, because this is, it's not my financial model. I'm not like making money off this book. It's all about like, I still have my day job to do. And so for me, it was all about being super structured, and I had to work it into my calendar. So I got up at 5 instead of 6, and I worked, before my family woke up in the morning for 60 to 90 minutes. I kind of got their permission on the weekends to come to my office and work for 4 or 5 hours. But I was able to kind of knock it out. I've always loved writing. I started keeping a journal when I was 3.5 years old, which is kind of funny to go back and look at them, but I've written every day of my life in a journal. And so this was always something I aspired to do, but I think it was a bit of a surprise even to me when I was like, I think I can maybe do this now. So I've been so happy I've done it, and who knows, maybe I'll do it again.
Oh, great answer. Last question for you, Jenna. How has your perspective on relationship development with clients changed over time as you've matured in your own sort of client relationship management? And I think this is really relevant for our audience, particularly the ones that are Bainies now. Maybe they're moving from sort of that, manager into senior manager and AP level, and to understand like how that mindset and actually the approach changes.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I was used to always being the youngest person in the room for a lot of my career. And as you can imagine, much like Bain, all of my clients are CEOs and boards of directors members. And when I was early in my career, here I am like 32 years old, whatever, and they're on average, 58. And I remember that before I had kids, I was really nervous that people wouldn't take me seriously once I became a mother. And I don't know why I had that in my head, but I did. But what was really delightfully surprising to learn was once I had children, it actually made me much more of a peer with them. And look, I think everybody's the same. Everybody wants to feel understood and that you empathize with them. And it is very stressful. If you're the CEO and your CFO quits, you feel exposed, you feel nervous, not just for, what you do, but for your shareholders. And so I think just bringing that empathy and kindness to the work I do, and feeling like a peer to the people I help represent, has really been additive to my career. So people from Bain are so amazing. I get so many reach outs from Bain alums or people who are contemplating doing something outside of Bain. And, I think the one piece of career advice I would give to those folks is try to be as targeted as you can, because, when you're coming out of a place like Bain, you pretty much could probably do anything you wanted to do, and anything you could set your mind to, you could accomplish. But most people's brains don't work that way, and people like to bucketize folks. And so, spend some time thinking through, what is my secret power and where do I want to deploy my many talents in the world? And if you can be as, directive as possible with folks like me who are recruiters and others, I think it will help you navigate your path in the world professionally that much easier.
Oh, what a great closing. Jenna, Kimberly, what you've given to us today has been such a gift. We're so thankful for your time, for the empathy that you bring, for the leadership. Jenna, thank you for Russell Reynolds for being such a great partner to Bain and Company. For all of you in the audience, Jenna had such great nuggets. If there was something that you missed, your favorite book or a favorite podcast, don't worry. We have this recorded. We'll share out the recording and we'll capture those in some bullet points. Jenna, we wish you nothing but continued and tremendous success. We all look forward to reading your book. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen. And I want to give a special thank you to Kimberly, who I've always admired. I've known her for over 2 decades, and her authenticity and empathy are truly world-class. And I'm so so privileged and honored to be a Bain alumna. So thank you to all of you, and Kimberly in particular. Love you, and great to see everyone today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for this time, Jenna. It's so wonderful to hear you, see you, and be inspired by what you've done. Thanks all.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.